Ladies and gentlemen, let's remind ourselves of why we're here. Let's remember the magnitude of the opportunity, the vastness of the potential prize. It's not every day that a G7 country gets to draw up a trade policy from scratch. And how we do that, how close we are to those cosmopolitan dinner parties that Crawford isn't invited to versus the default of suspicion, makes an immense difference not only to the prosperity of our own people, but to the viability of the international trading system. Free trade, the greatest benefit that a government can bestow upon its people, is in every country unpopular, wrote Lord Macaulay, the great historian, poet, and Indian administrator. That was in 1824. Think of how much more true those words are today. It's kind of bizarre if you think about it, right? Because between 1824 and now, there has been an unprecedented rise in living standards. According to the great economic historian Deirdre McCluskey, something like 3,000%. This is a real hockey stick graph. Human progress went along very, very slowly, and then at the beginning of the 19th century, things took off. And we reached a pinnacle of wealth that would have been previously unimaginable. Why? Largely because we began to extend our supply lines and to extend the principles of specialization and exchange. And yet, today, as in 1824, that remains an incredibly unpopular position. And the role of the TRA, if you like, is to mediate between public opinion and the policies that deliver prosperity. I'm not going to get into the details of how it's done, because you've got many more expert speakers than me on that. But I just want to run through why I think it is that we have this job to do. Why is it that this extraordinary phenomenon of human enrichment remains unpopular, that you have crowds of young people, idealistic, altruistic young people across the developing and developed world, protesting against trade agreements and protesting against TTIP and all the rest of it, thinking that they're standing up for the poor, when in reality, of course, they're doing the opposite. I think there are three reasons, if I group them together under broad headings, why specialization, exchange, and the removal of barriers remain unpopular. One is political, one is psychological, and one I can only call aesthetic. And I'll run through them in order. First, the political objections. This one's actually very easily summarized. In fact, I can summarize it in 4 words. Free trade brings dispersed gains, concentrated losses. In politics, you are looking at the people who bring pressure directly to bear on you, rather than on the general population who may benefit very slightly and not thank you for it. So let me give the example, it's a perennial one, of US sugar. US sugar has been highly subsidized and protected pretty much since the revolution. In lots of stock exchanges around the world, American sugar is quoted separately from world sugar prices. And this has been true all the way through. Now, every study shows that this is bad for the US generally. That for every job propped up on a sugarcane plantation in Florida, between 6 and 17 downstream jobs are lost in food processing. Confectioners have moved to Canada or to Mexico. My cousins in Philadelphia always used to ask me to bring Cadbury's chocolate, because the reason that the Hershey's was so disgusting is because they make it with corn syrup rather than with sugar, because sugar is so excessively priced. So why is it that for the better part of 2 centuries, successive governments have pursued a policy that is obviously deleterious to American prosperity? Well, the answer is that, if you like, those jobs in Florida already exist. They know exactly who they are, and they vote accordingly. Sugar producers maintain a big super PAC, give generously to both parties. The 6 to 17 food processing jobs exist only in the subjunctive, right? They don't know who they would be. They can't vote. And so, government after government has pursued the wrong policy because it's been following the incentives. Now, this happens across the board. Generally, the older and more politically connected and most unionized industries have a bigger voice, but not always. Let me touch briefly on the question of the steel remedies that you guys dealt with last year. What was striking to me is how little that case was put in terms of the benefits to the economy overall, other than by one or two people at the TRA. So let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that it really had been dumped steel, right? Let's say that it really was unfair trade. I'm one of those people that Crawford was talking about who doesn't really think there is much truth in unfair trade. I think I take the view that if the Chinese want to subsidize steel, that is a gift from the Chinese taxpayer to the British consumer. But let's say that that had happened. What would have been the impact on the UK economy? The impact would have been that construction and car making and electrical appliances and planes all suddenly got a massive boost. They all became much more productive without having to do anything, because the key component had fallen in price. Laying railways would have suddenly been an awful lot cheaper. And as a result, there have been many more jobs. People would have had more money in their pockets to spend on other things. That would have stimulated the whole economy, which would have created even more jobs. And at the end of the day, not a single person would have voted for the government that did it, because they'd have attributed their good fortune to themselves and not to the removal of the steel tax. Whereas when you go the other way, the people that your dispersed gains, concentrated losses, the people whose losses you are seeking to prevent in South Wales or whatever, they know exactly whom to vote for, and they behave accordingly. And that really, as I say, that's the role of an organization like this. How to get the benefit as much as possible of globalization, specialization, and exchange in a world where these things are unpopular. Which brings me to objection number 2. The first is political, the second is psychological. Free trade is, in the exact sense of the word, counterintuitive. It runs up against instincts and intuitions that are buried deep in our genome. We didn't evolve in a world of skyscrapers and superabundance. We have the inclinations of hunter-gatherers on the savannas of Pleistocene Africa. We want to have a stash of food to get us through the winter. That's the most basic human desire. And when you translate that into modern politics, it translates into protectionism. Oh, it's very alarming that Britain imports 42% of all its food. The idea of depending on invisible strangers for stuff that you can't yet see, the basis of a modern economy, offends our inner caveman or cavewoman. Right? It feels wrong. And however often you explain the benefit, people still find that it makes them uneasy. This got much worse during and as a consequence of the pandemic. I lost count of how many people said to me during COVID, "Surely, Hannon, even you must see why we now need to grow more of our own food." Really? Really, that's the take you got from COVID? I mean, the lockdown hit, if you remember, at the end of March 2020, beginning of the time that farmers in this country call the hungry gap, when we effectively don't produce any food. We've reached the end of the winter harvests. We're not digging up any more cabbages and turnips and potatoes. We haven't yet reached the first of the main harvest. Had we not been able to import what we needed, we would have been living on rhubarb and asparagus, maybe a bit of nettle too. Pretty much what we produce between late March and early May. Fortunately, the system worked beautifully. Despite all of the simultaneous stress test of the global pandemic, markets continue to operate, and we bought what we needed, and the system worked. And yet, almost nobody will draw that inference because it runs up against these deep-rooted intuitions. It is just alarming. It makes people feel uncanny, uneasy, eerie, to think that somehow we're not self-sufficient. And yet, often you can demonstrate these things, if you like, by taking the logic to its extreme. Consider the countries that are at opposite ends of that spectrum. There is a country in the world that has elevated self-sufficiency, import substitution, to its ruling principle, and that's North Korea. Juche. They try and produce everything themselves. The last place on the planet where you still have man-made famine. The other end of that scale, Singapore, doesn't produce a single edible ounce. Totally dependent on imports for its drinking water, for its food, for its electricity. The cheapest and most secure food supplies in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, where would you rather live? And yet, that is, however often you explain the case, logically, that is a difficult, counterintuitive case. And that's why one is constantly in this game of mediation. Brings me to the third objection, the one that I couldn't come up with a better way of explaining it than aesthetic. I was born in Lima, Peru. And when I grew up in the 70s, Lima was a city surrounded by shantytowns, rising on every slope that surrounded it. Barriadas, they were called, las barriadas de Lima. And we would have friends who'd come from here or from Europe or from America, and they would do the usual thing that you do as a tourist. They'd come and see us in Lima, and then they'd go and visit Cusco, and they'd walk to Machu Picchu, and they'd come back, and almost always, they'd ask a variant of the same question. Why are people leaving these pristine, beautiful Andean villages and coming to live among the open sewers and the traffic fumes of the barriada? My friends, that's a very first world question. No Peruvian ever needed to ask why you would leave a village where there was no electricity, no running water, no job, no clinic, no school. The process of industrialization and development is not aesthetically pleasing. But people are capable of making rational decisions in their self-interest. Much later in life, I had occasion to spend a bit of time in one of the barriadas. And I have to tell you, I have come across a greater sense of hopelessness in some high unemployment black spots in Europe than I did there. I mean, obviously, there's a disparity in basic living standards, but there was also a sense of possibility, of industriousness. Everyone was doing something. They were selling cigarettes at traffic lights. They were sorting through rubbish for recycling and passing it on. Everyone was busily engaged, and they understood that it was transitional. They didn't expect to spend their whole lives there. It was transitional for them, and by the way, it was also transitional as a district. I'm going back to Lima the day after tomorrow, and I expect that even since I was last there, a lot of what we were euphemistically encouraged to call the pueblos jóvenes will now be plumbed in. Where the corrugated iron roofs will have been replaced by proper brick and mortar. Not only is it transitional for the people passing through it, but the areas improve as long as we give them opportunity. And I think an awful lot of Western policy, particularly Western international aid policy, is based on a fundamentally aesthetic shudder at the look of these places as they go through the process that we began as a country and that every other industrialized country has gone through at one time or another. I look at my children's school homework. The repeated theme of it is, oh, isn't it terrible that these poor women in Vietnam are stitching trainers together for 50p a day, victimized by these evil Western companies. I actually got into an argument with one of them, and I made her Google it, and the average income of somebody working for a foreign company in Vietnam is nearly 200% of the average wage in Vietnam, right? You wouldn't want to work in a sweatshop in Hanoi, neither would I. But the alternative for you was not bending your back in a paddy field all day. Let's at least give the people who are working in these places the dignity of agency. Let's assume that they are capable of making rational decisions. Let's assume that they are also capable of understanding that this will be transitional. And if we really want to help, what can we do? Obviously, buy more of their stuff, right? So that wages go up and conditions improve. But also sell them more of our stuff cheaply so that they have more to spend on other things. The basic case for free trade and specialization, which so often get lost. Now, I'd say all of these things in a slightly elegiac spirit, I suppose, because I can see it all slipping away. I think that the impact of the lockdown and the pandemic has been to bolster the defenders of self-sufficiency and autarky in almost every country. It was little reported that Xi Jinping, at the recent meeting of the People's Assembly in Beijing, the one where his predecessor was manhandled out, also took the opportunity to make a speech saying we need to be self-sufficient, we need to grow all our own food, I'm setting aside 300 million acres because we mustn't depend on the West. Well, if every country starts doing that, then we end up in the kind of world that we were just getting away from in Macaulay's time. The world where you have self-inflicted poverty in pursuit of self-sufficiency. But that's the big prize. Can we keep going? The miracle of what it was that turned poor, struggling countries into the extraordinary global community we see today. This was our historic role as a country. We invented free trade in theory, in the writings of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and we then became the first people to do it in practice from the 1840s on. Every visitor to Victorian Britain was struck by the amazing increase in living standards for people on ordinary income, something that had never happened anywhere in the world until then. If we have a role, surely, as an independent trading country now, it is again to make the argument for the advantages of specialization and exchange. And I think it's the people in this room who have to join and make that case. I think I'm almost out of time, but do you want me to take a couple of questions, Michelle, or how are we doing? With pleasure. Yeah.
Quite loud anyway. I'm quite loud. So is there a case, Lord Hannan, for support of any strategic industries in the UK?
I think that support, if by support you mean tariffs, then no. If by support you mean subsidy, then I still think probably not, but it is by far the less damaging of the two. Okay? So if for reasons of political viability, we decide that we have to have a steel sector of a certain size. By the way, I'm really not sure that is the case. If you look at the figures, we export quite a lot of steel as well as importing it. We tend to export goods, high-end stuff, and import cheap stuff. And no single foreign country accounts for more than 14% of our total imports. Our total imports, not our total consumption, right? We're still our own biggest supplier by a long way. But if for whatever reason you dismiss all of that and you think we desperately need a steel industry, then it is much, much cheaper just to give it a straightforward subsidy rather than to mess up our whole trading system with tariffs or other barriers, the revenues of which do not go to the steel industry.
What if the downstream gains are not proportionate to the losses of the producers? So, for example, a marginal increase in productivity versus closed plants.
You see, the trouble with this is whenever you say, here is the important producer, they become more and more inefficient. I mean, that's when people say, let's nurture our infant industries, there's almost never been a case of where they grow into strong, healthy industries. They remain infantilized. If you look at our food sector, if you listen to the NFU, you'd think that all we produce in this country is lamb and beef. Lamb and beef are a tiny, tiny part of what is already a fairly tiny agrarian sector. But the reason that the NFU is obsessed with it, the reason that Minette Batters talks of little else, is because those are the bits that need help because they've always had help. And you know what? We didn't really have much of a beef industry here until we joined the EEC. We were in the habit of importing our beef from Argentina, Uruguay, Australia, Canada, and the US. When the common external tariff came in and the common agricultural policy, we created a space that was then filled by people who enterprisingly pursued the objectives. And of course, they now dig in as though this was some immemorial part of rural life, but most of it only goes back to the late 70s. Why is it that we talk all the time about beef and lamb? Because that's the unproductive bit, because it's the protected bit. Now, our pig industry is doing pretty well. It's got a specific issue with feed at the moment, but it's historically been more than viable. Poultry, again, perfectly viable. Arable, we can compete with anyone in the world. The odd thing is that it's or maybe, no, it's not odd. The unsurprising thing is that it's precisely the bits where we say we need to protect the consumer interests where we end up, in fact, undermining it by making it less and less competitive against overseas rights.
What if foreign state actors want to deliberately undermine UK manufacturing capacity to weaken the UK's geopolitical position?
So let me first of all make a general point that there is a difference between invigilating and policing existing rules and trade policy. So very often, when we talk about trade with countries, let's say with China, that people think might engage in theft of intellectual property or might put trapdoors into Huawei or whatever it is, that's really nothing to do with trade policy. That's to do with policing the existing system. All of the things that people were complaining about vis-a-vis China were happening when there was no trade deal with China beyond the basic WTO rule. The Chinese quasi-blockade of some Australian products is happening when they have a trade deal, right? So there's a difference between trade deals, which are identifying and removing obstacles, and then ensuring that you have a robust system, which is to do with enforcement and the rule of law. But let's move specifically to what if a hostile power decided, let's say, to wipe out our steel sector, since we're talking about steel, by producing super cheap steel. It would only work if there were no other steel-producing country in the world. Think about it. If there were only the UK and this hostile power, and our steel foundries, dried up and our factories stopped working and we wouldn't be able to get them started again because it takes so long, I could see a problem. But that is not the case. There is a very viable, competitive global market. You look at what were the top 10 countries from whom we imported steel last year. China was not in them. The top of the list are Netherlands, Spain, Germany, right? And to repeat, these are top import top import sources, not overall. We'd still be at the top of that list ourselves if you count us. So it doesn't even work in theory. All you would do is switch your purchase back to somebody else rather than the country that engaged in the dumping. In the meantime, as I say, you'd have had this massive boost to your economy paid for directly by the taxpayers of the country that was foolish enough to do it.
Thank you. This is a rather meaty last question. I know everybody wants a cup of tea, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there an unfixable schism in the Brexit movement with a handful of global Britain advocates versus the majority of Brexit voters wanting less globalisation?
Well, look, there were 17.2 million people who voted leave, right? So that was bound to cover the whole spectrum from extreme left to extreme right and everything in between. And by the way, the same was also true of the nearly 17 million people who voted Remain. How could it not be? You had these two immense coalitions. It is probably true, it's probably fair to say, that the salience of Brexit in national debate for the 3 years after the vote tended to change people's positions, or rather tended to become a part of people's identity politically. One of the very regrettable things that followed the vote was that there was this polarization, this culture war. It stopped being about money or sovereignty or migration. It started becoming about what kind of people do we imagine being on the other side. Delete as appropriate. Sneering snobs who secretly hate their own country, or ignorant working class oafs who fell for unscrupulous demagogues. Right? Once it becomes about the kind of people that you imagine being on the other side, compromise becomes very difficult. And there were then these two purity spirals, and part of that, I remember when Liam Fox was Secretary of State at DIT, he did some polling on this, and it was very revealing. The sorts of people who would have been in those cosmopolitan dinner parties of Crawford's suddenly started becoming very anti-trade, because they associated global Britain with Brexit, and they didn't like the people who were talking about it. And there was this rather odd retreat from internationalist, liberal trade values from the people who had previously been its biggest supporters. there was also a converse flip the other way. So there had been a certain kind of UKIP voter who, in the 90s and early 2000s would have said, oh, I'm very worried about the French being allowed to own our energy companies, and, this is a strategic resource. They were suddenly all for global Britain for the same reason. They liked the people talking about it and didn't like the people attacking it. I don't think that has entirely gone away even now. When I sit in debates on trade in the House of Lords, I'm sorry to say that there are a number of my colleagues there whose starting point is that they don't want anything good to have come out of Brexit, and therefore they are effectively against every trade deal with everyone except the EU. Now, they probably haven't verbalized the thought to themselves that way, but it's very, very clear. And there was a particularly delicious moment when we had two debates, one that followed the other. The first was about food poverty. And there'd been a report, a very thorough report from a crossbench peer, which contained the astonishing fact that for the richest 10%, food purchases represented, I think, less than 17% of their post-housing income, whereas for the bottom 10%, it was 76% of their something like that. It was, and everyone was saying, this is, what can we do about this? Remarkable unanimity on all sides that this was not a good thing and we should lower food. By a coincidence of tabling, the next debate was on the Australia FTA. And all the people who'd been complaining about the price of food, without a blush, said, we've got to protect our farmers against this flood of cheap food from Australia. Right? And I'm afraid that was really the position that they'd formed in 2016 and afterwards still dictating how they see things now. And that, I think, is really regrettable, because we do have this huge opportunity if we're serious. Other countries have pursued free trade. The Singapores and the New Zealands, but no offense to any Singapore, I don't know if there's any Singaporeans here, but I do see at least one New Zealander here. No offense when I say that New Zealand is a small and distant place, and although that has brought huge benefits to Kiwis themselves, its impact on the wider global trading system was limited. If a country the size of ours, fifth or sixth biggest economy on the planet, pursued a New Zealand-type approach to trade, then the impact would be felt well beyond these shores, and there would be a tangible gain for people on every continent.
Lord Hannan, thank you very much.